It was supposed to be an ordinary winter trek. Two seasoned hikers, one a retired geologist, the other a photographer with a taste for forgotten places, had veered off the marked trail in a remote stretch of the Austrian Alps, chasing rumors of an old avalanche path recently cleared by melting ice. The air was razor-thin, snow crusted like armor beneath their boots. But it was something else entirely that stopped them cold, a glint of metal half buried in a wall of ice, dull and rusted, but unmistakably out of place. At first, they thought it might be wreckage from a lost weather station or communications tower. But the shape was wrong, the angles too aerodynamic, a wing, then a shattered canopy. And inside, what neither of them were prepared for. A cockpit sealed in frost, and behind the stick, a human skeleton still strapped into its seat. The figure was frozen in time, slumped forward, leather helmet still buckled beneath a hollow jaw. The flight suit was faded but intact, with patches and insignia half obscured by frost. One gloved hand rested on the control column. The other clutched something against the chest, a worn notebook, its binding stiff with age. They stood in silence, snow swirling in the windless air, unsure whether they'd just stumbled upon a piece of forgotten history or the doorway to something far stranger. The fuselage was that of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's infamous World War II-era fighter. Crumpled but recognizable, the plane had buried itself nose-first into the glacier, then disappeared for 8 decades beneath snowpack and time. They marked the location, documented the scene, and descended in silence. Later, investigators would confirm what they had found. A near-intact World War II fighter plane lost in 1943. Its pilot never recovered until now. Word spread quickly through alpine villages and aviation forums. An 8 one-year-old ghost had just returned from the ice. But beneath the fascination, something darker clung to the discovery. Who was the pilot? Why had no one ever found the wreck? And how had the body remained untouched, sealed in a cockpit coffin of glass and steel for nearly a century? The answers would lie not just in the wreckage, but in the fading ink of a flight journal and a final mission flown on Christmas Eve, 1943. The airfield outside Munich was buried in fog that morning, the kind of cold that turned breath to frost before it left the lips. War didn't pause for holidays. The Luftwaffe was stretched thin, losses mounting across the Eastern Front and Allied bombers pushing deeper into German skies. Yet on December 24, 1943, one young pilot buttoned his flight jacket, adjusted his gloves, and climbed into the cockpit of his Bf 109 like it was just another mission. His name was Oberleutnant Hans Keller, 24 years old, born in Stuttgart, son of a machinist and a schoolteacher. He'd flown 61 combat missions, downed 6 Allied aircraft, and had a leave request pending for Christmas Day. He never made it home. Records from Luftflotte 3 show Keller was assigned to a weather patrol and reconnaissance loop near the Bavarian-Austrian border routine, low risk, a formality in a region temporarily quiet. The Messerschmitt roared to life just after 0900 hours, Keller's voice crisp over the base radio. Then nothing. No emergency transmission, no mayday, no radar return. One moment he was climbing into cloud cover, the next, gone. The weather over the Alps that day was treacherous. Sheets of dense snow, wind, gusts cresting 70 kilometers per hour, visibility down to meters. Search efforts launched that afternoon found no wreckage. No parachute, no beacon. The terrain was too harsh, and the war too busy to care about a single missing pilot. Within 48 hours, Keller's file was stamped Vermisst, missing. A few weeks later, it was quietly updated to presumed dead. But Hans Keller wasn't the type to disappear. Those who flew with him said he was sharp, meticulous, almost superstitious about pre-flight checks. He wrote letters home every week without fail. He carried his younger sister's photo in his left breast pocket always. His mother lit a candle every Christmas Eve for the rest of her life, refusing to believe her son had simply vanished into cloud and silence. For decades, the disappearance became just another unsolved footnote in Luftwaffe archives, a name lost among thousands. But Hans Keller hadn't vanished. His mission didn't end in mystery, it ended in the mountains, at the edge of a glacier, where ice swallowed the sky and time stood still. Now, 81 years later, the mountain was finally ready to give him back. Before he became a ghost in the cockpit of a frozen fighter, Hans Keller was a boy who dreamed in blueprints. Born in 1,919 inches, Stuttgart, he grew up in the shadow of a world still reeling from the First War. His father, a machinist at Daimler, taught him how engines worked by disassembling bicycles in their apartment courtyard. His mother, a former schoolteacher, instilled in him a love for structure and language. Keller excelled in mathematics, physics, and the mechanical arts. He was meant for more than war. By 1938, he had secured admission to the University of Munich for aeronautical engineering. Then, the world caught fire. Germany's rearmament meant students with technical minds were swiftly redirected. Keller's professors recommended him for officer training in the Luftwaffe. He passed his aptitude tests with ease. What followed was a year of accelerated training, flight simulations, and eventually combat sorties. He was a natural in the air, disciplined, calm, and precise. But in his letters home, a different picture emerged. He wrote often to his sister Anna and his mother, rarely mentioning combat. Instead, his words dwelled on clouds, speed, and the eerie silence that filled his cockpit at altitude. "When I am above the clouds," one letter read, "I no longer feel part of this world. There is no war up there. Just wind and sky and the sound of the engine reminding me I'm still alive." Another letter from the summer of '43 simply said, "I don't know if I'm fighting for Germany anymore or just trying to survive long enough to fly again tomorrow." By December of that year, Keller had completed over 60 missions. He wasn't chasing glory. He was counting the days. A scheduled leave was finally approved, and if all went well, he'd be home in Stuttgart on Christmas Day, just 24 hours away. He had already shipped a parcel ahead: chocolates, a scarf for his mother, a carved toy glider for Anna's son. His last mission, a low-risk patrol to the Southern Air Corridor, was meant to be routine. An hour in the sky, a signature on a report, then home. He even packed his civilian shoes. But Hans Keller never made it back to the airfield. The mission turned, the sky closed in, and the war that had consumed millions claimed one more name written in frost, hidden in silence, and lost to time for the next 8 decades. Christmas Eve, 1943, began with a clear plan. Oberleutnant Hans Keller was assigned a standard patrol route, routine airspace surveillance from Munich to the eastern edge of the Tyrol region and back. A final box to check before his leave could begin. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 was fueled and flight-ready before dawn, and the forecast had called for only light flurries. But within hours, everything changed. New intelligence arrived before Keller's flight. A cluster of Allied bombers had been spotted moving across southern Germany, high altitude, likely en route to industrial targets near Linz. The Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept. Keller's orders were amended on the tarmac. He was to alter course toward the Austrian border and assess possible bomber movement over the Alps. It wasn't combat, just eyes in the sky, a deviation of maybe 50 kilometers. But in a Messerschmitt, 50 kilometers could mean the difference between cloud cover and a death spiral. Keller acknowledged the change and took off just before 0900 hours. From the airfield's last visual, he disappeared into thickening snow. Weather conditions worsened quickly. A sudden Arctic front surged down from the north, pushing heavy snow and zero visibility across the Central Alps. Wind gusts increased sharply. Ground control lost all radio contact 5 minutes after takeoff. The last radar ping placed him 37 kilometers east-southeast of Garmisch-Partenkirchen, just above the mountains, flying blind. Several other flights were grounded that morning. Keller's squadron mates later recalled they were ordered to remain on standby as conditions deteriorated. He had been the only pilot airborne in the region during the weather collapse. The decision to divert him, some later claimed, was bureaucratic inertia, orders made without accounting for what was actually happening in the sky. No one reported hearing an engine. No SOS was ever picked up. No impact crater or debris field was ever discovered. After 48 hours, the Luftwaffe classified the flight as unrecoverable. There were too many losses, too many fronts, and not enough time. His name joined the long scroll of missing airmen. The war machine rolled on. But now, with his wreck discovered, frozen into the rock face of an alpine glacier, the redirected flight no longer looked routine. It looked rushed, improvised, dangerous. The kind of decision made by someone who never expected the war to come home in a coffin of ice. Hans Keller didn't die in battle. He died in silence, lost in the mountains on the night before Christmas, searching the sky for a threat that never came. The records are sparse. A blip on a radar screen. A voice check-in that never got a reply. Then static. The 24th of December, 1943, 9:11 hours. That was the last time Oberleutnant Hans Keller's aircraft was acknowledged by Luftwaffe Command. The operator on duty noted intermittent signal loss due to atmospheric interference. In reality, no one knew where he went after he disappeared into the clouds. The storm had swallowed him whole. Within hours, the radar station at Mittenwald began cross-referencing patrol flight paths. Keller's Messerschmitt, Bf 109, had been routed southeast toward the Austrian Alps, with orders to observe high-altitude airspace for possible Allied bomber movement. The mission was never combat, at least. It wasn't supposed to be. But when no radio contact was re-established and no aircraft returned, Command defaulted to wartime assumption. He'd either been shot down or forced to crash land in hostile territory. Initial search efforts were thin. The war was escalating, resources strained. 2 aircraft were dispatched to scan the general area later that afternoon, but visibility was near zero. Ground teams were not sent. Airfield chatter turned speculative. Some said Keller must have flown into a mountain face in the storm. Others whispered about engine failure or a mid-air collision with Allied aircraft. But there was no proof, no debris, no sighting, just a young pilot gone without a trace. By January 1944, Keller's name appeared on the official list of missing personnel. Vermisst, lost, not presumed dead, not yet. His family was notified by telegram. The wording was cold. No further information available at this time. His mother sent 2 letters to his commanding officer, both unanswered. Within the squadron, Keller's disappearance became a footnote. Another name in a war that was devouring thousands. But there was something different about this one. Keller was experienced, methodical, the kind of pilot who triple-checked his fuel and recalculated altitude constantly. He wasn't the type to panic or make a foolish decision. And yet he'd vanished so completely, so cleanly, that even seasoned officers couldn't explain it. A ghost pilot in a ghost plane. In the years that followed, mountaineers and shepherds in the region occasionally reported hearing strange metallic sounds in the wind, echoes off the cliffs that had no source. Nothing was ever found. Nothing ever confirmed. Until now. The wreckage was like something pulled from a time capsule. Embedded in a glacier near the Ötztal Alps, at over 9,000 feet elevation, the Messerschmitt had come to rest nose down in ice and rock, the tail barely visible through years of snowfall. When glacial melt finally exposed a sliver of metal, it took only days for news to spread. Forensic specialists from the Austrian Bundesheer and aviation historians descended on the site, unsure of what exactly they would find. They expected bones, maybe a piece of uniform. They didn't expect a body. They didn't expect it to be whole. Inside the cockpit, still strapped in, lay the remains of Oberleutnant Hans Keller. The skeleton was remarkably intact, sealed inside an icy tomb that had preserved not just bone, but fragments of flesh, scraps of wool and leather, and the rusted buckle of a harness. His hands were frozen in place, one on the stick, the other cradling a small, leather-bound notebook against his chest. A flight journal. Recovery teams worked carefully, melting away layers of ice with heated air instead of tools. Nothing could be damaged. This was no longer a crash site. It was a grave. Tucked into the collar of his flight suit, they found a rusted dog tag. The inscription still legible: H. Keller, 44/28, Luftwaffe. DNA analysis, cross-referenced with a surviving niece in Stuttgart, confirmed what the dog tag had already told them. It was him. His uniform, though moth-eaten and faded, still bore insignia: a Luftwaffe eagle, a pilot's badge, the faint outlines of rank tabs on his collar. A sidearm, standard-issue Walther P-38, remained in its holster. There were no signs it had been drawn. No signs of a struggle, no fire, no panic. The Messerschmitt had simply gone down, wedged itself into the glacier, and disappeared from history. What stunned investigators most was the journal. Despite water damage and decades of compression, many of the pages were readable. The last entries stopped just hours before the flight. One page had a list of fuel calculations. Another a simple note: visibility poor, wind rising, should be routine. That word routine underlined twice. Nothing about what happened next was routine. 81 years had passed since Keller vanished, and now, here he was, suspended in time, the last seconds of his life preserved not in memory, but in ice. It was smaller than expected, just a leather-bound notebook, no bigger than a postcard, the kind pilots often kept tucked inside their flight suits. Time had warped its spine, and the pages were stiff, many glued together by decades of ice. But when forensic archivists began the delicate process of separating the sheets, a window opened into the final moments of Hans Keller's life. Most of the entries were mundane: flight logs, fuel consumption estimates, altitude calculations, notes on engine performance, the kind of things a meticulous pilot would jot down mid-mission. There were pages of diagrams, too, rough sketches of cloud patterns, enemy formations, airfield layouts. It was all precise, mechanical, orderly, until the last 3 pages. There, the handwriting changed, still legible, but hurried. The first note, dated 2/4.1/2.43, simply read, visibility gone, complete whiteout, controls sluggish, climbing for clearance. Beneath it, hastily scribbled in pencil, almost too faint to see, stick icing, port wing slow to respond. Trying to maintain heading. The next page was smeared, the pencil dulled by trembling hands, but the final line stood out in dark, frantic strokes. If I do not return, forgive me. That was it. No signature, no date, just a single sentence etched into the page like a last breath. It wasn't a note for command. It wasn't even a log entry. It was something else. A farewell. A confession. An acknowledgement that he knew somewhere above the clouds, deep in the storm, that he wasn't going to make it back. Investigators sat in silence when the entry was first read aloud. For a man lost to history, the message hit with unexpected force. There was no bravado, no military flourish, just clarity. Hans Keller hadn't died in confusion. He died knowing exactly what was happening. And he wanted someone, anyone, to understand that it wasn't recklessness that brought him down. It was the sky. The journal is now considered one of the most valuable World War II aviation artifacts ever recovered from a crash site. Not because it tells us about the war, but because it tells us about a single man, alone in the clouds, fighting ice, silence, and the fading light of Christmas Eve. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 should have been torn apart, by the terrain, by the weather, by time. But the moment forensic teams reached the crash site, It was clear. Nature hadn't destroyed the aircraft, it had hidden it. The wreckage was wedged into a steep, ice-packed couloir near the peak of a forgotten ridge in the Ötztal Alps. There were no trails, no roads, no sign that anyone had been there in decades. The silence was unbroken, except for the creak of shifting ice. Experts from Austria's Alpine Research Institute were called in, along with glaciologists and aviation historians. Their conclusion was as remarkable as the discovery itself. Keller's plane had likely struck the slope at a shallow angle, skidding into a snowbank during a whiteout. The combination of soft powder and sub-zero temperatures had cushioned the impact. Within days, fresh snowfall buried the wreck. Then, as winter became decades, the glacier did the rest, encasing the entire fuselage like a sarcophagus. The Messerschmitt's survival was due to more than just ice. The aircraft's position, facing upslope and shielded by overhanging rock, placed it just beyond avalanche zones. It was frozen, yes, but it was also protected. A natural vault sealed by altitude, geography, and silence. No aerial surveys ever passed directly over the area. No rescue teams ventured that far west of the presumed crash corridor. For 81 years, the fighter remained invisible. Then came the heat. In the last 2 decades, rising global temperatures had accelerated glacial retreat throughout the region. Satellite data shows the ice in that part of the Alps has thinned by nearly 30 meters since 2000. What had once been buried under snowpack and ancient ice was slowly exhumed by the sun. It wasn't discovery that found Hans Keller, it was erosion. Melting ice revealed a wingtip, then a section of tail rudder, then a glint of steel under a crust of frost. A relic from a world at war, pushed gently back into daylight by the steady, indifferent work of climate and time. As one researcher quietly put it, "We didn't find the plane. The mountain decided it was time to give it back." The final moments of Hans Keller's last mission can now be traced with sobering clarity. Using a combination of terrain analysis, Luftwaffe flight paths, and modern meteorological modeling, aviation historians have reconstructed the fatal arc of his doomed flight. It began with the diversion orders rerouting him southeast to track reported Allied bomber activity. What should have been a short patrol turned into a death spiral the moment the weather shifted. The storm descended fast. Wind shear increased. Snow thickened to blinding white. With no horizon, no reference points, and radio silence, Keller would have been flying blind. His journal confirms he attempted to climb, likely in a desperate bid to clear the mountainous terrain that suddenly surrounded him. The Bf-109, agile in combat but unforgiving in low visibility, began to struggle. The air grew thinner as he climbed. Then the controls began to freeze. Experts believe he was trying to crest a high ridge when the engine stalled from a combination of ice buildup and loss of lift. The aircraft banked left, unresponsive, and descended too low to recover. The crash site shows minimal fragmentation, suggesting the impact was not at full speed but enough to kill instantly. The nose buried deep into the snow-packed slope. The canopy cracked but held. Keller, still strapped in, died on impact. There were no attempts to exit the aircraft. No signs of movement. His seat harness was still secured. One hand remained clutching the flight journal across his chest, a gesture that spoke volumes. He had not panicked. He had not tried to flee. He had done everything right, followed his training, fought for control to the very end. But against the force of a mountain storm, even precision becomes meaningless. The cockpit became his tomb, the glacier his coffin. For 81 years, the Alps kept his secret. No scavengers, no erosion, no disturbance. Just wind, ice, and the slow march of time. A young man's last moments preserved not in legend or metal, but in cold reality caught between cloud and cliff, lost to history until the day the ice gave him back. In a quiet suburb outside Stuttgart, the name Hans Keller still hangs in the air like a breath that never fully exhaled. For decades, he was the family ghost, the uncle who left for Christmas, and never came home. His photograph, black and white, always smiling, stood on a hallway shelf next to a wooden clock and a faded letter opener. No one in the current generation ever met him, but they knew the story by heart. His niece, Martina Keller, now in her 62nd, remembers her grandmother lighting a candle every Christmas Eve. She didn't talk about him, Martina says softly, but the candle was always there. Same time, same window. To her, Hans was a mythological figure, a boy who vanished into the war, never returned, and somehow remained suspended in time. His sister Anna, Hans's closest sibling, never married. She waited for news that never came, Martina says. I think a part of her never left 1943. When news of the discovery reached them, first a phone call, then a flurry of official letters, it reopened a wound they didn't realize was still bleeding. DNA confirmation, military documentation, preserved belongings. For many families, that would offer closure. For the Kellers, it offered something stranger, reality. We never thought he'd be found, says Klaus, a grandnephew. He was a name in a story. Suddenly, he was real. The hardest part wasn't the confirmation, it was the detail. That he had died alone, high in the mountains, strapped to a frozen cockpit with a notebook across his chest. That he hadn't been shot down. That he hadn't abandoned his post. That he had done everything right and still died anyway. The family declined a state burial, choosing instead to inter Hans beside his parents in the local cemetery. The Luftwaffe offered military honors. The family accepted, quietly. On the day of the burial, there were no speeches, only the low hum of wind through the trees and the click of boots on stone. A headstone now stands where the candle once burned. It reads simply, Hans Keller, 1919, 1943, returned 2024. The war took him, the mountain kept him, but time finally brought him home. Hans Keller was one of thousands, a name buried in the ledgers of a war that devoured men faster than history could remember them. Between 1939 and 1945, over 70,000 German soldiers were reported missing in action, thousands of them, pilots, swallowed by cloud, sea, or fire. Some vanished over enemy territory, others into the ocean, and many like Keller were lost within the unforgiving terrain of their own homeland. The war was not just brutal in scale, it was efficient in erasure. Keller's story is not extraordinary because of how he died. It's extraordinary because he was found. His final flight was not marked by glory or combat, but by cold, quiet failure, the kind of death that doesn't make headlines or memorial plaques. There were no medals waiting, no last transmission of valor. Just whiteout, silence, and the sound of an engine choking on ice. To historians, Keller's rediscovery is significant not for what it reveals about one pilot, but for what it reminds us about an entire generation. He was young, intelligent, deeply conflicted about the war he'd been pulled into. In his letters, he never spoke of enemies, only of clouds, wind, and the feeling of detachment that came with altitude. For him, flight was escape, the cockpit, a sanctuary, the war, an obligation. In this way, Keller becomes a symbol of something far more haunting than heroism, the normalcy of sacrifice. The way men with dreams and futures were consumed by a machine that measured success in units and payloads, not lives. He died not in the blaze of battle, but in an empty sky over familiar ground. And because his body was never found, his story ended not with a funeral, but with an ellipsis. For 81 years, his family lived with a question mark. Now, finally, they have a period. Hans Keller didn't survive the war. But he survived history's forgetfulness. A quiet man in a cold cockpit, remembered not for how he fought, but for how he was lost. The recovery of Hans Keller's crash site wasn't just a moment of historical interest, it became a forensic milestone. Glacial entombment, High-altitude isolation and sub-freezing temperatures had preserved his remains in a state almost unheard of in aviation archaeology. What forensic teams found wasn't merely a wreck, it was a time capsule, sealed by ice and waiting. His skeleton was nearly complete, positioned upright in the pilot's seat. No signs of trauma beyond what would be expected from impact. Soft tissue had long since deteriorated, but the leather of his flight helmet was still pliable. Bone marrow, extracted from a femur, held enough viable DNA to confirm his identity against a niece's family sample. His gloves were still on, his boots still laced. The uniform, though degraded, retained enough structure to show rank and division. Even patches of color remained faded. Luftwaffe insignia, dulled brass buttons. One of the most surprising discoveries was a small, rusted compass tucked into an interior jacket pocket. Beside it, a folded terrain map, hand-annotated with pencil markings that matched notations in his journal. Cataloging revealed a personal inventory that felt painfully human. A Walther P-38 sidearm, still holstered. A crushed cigarette tin, a brass fountain pen, a rosary knotted around a belt loop. And in a small inner pouch, wrapped in waxed paper, a chocolate bar, frozen solid and intact, stamped with the faded insignia of the Wehrmacht's field ration supply. The condition of these artifacts stunned conservators. Most World War II crash sites are skeletal, burnt-out shells stripped by time and weather. Keller's plane was preserved with such integrity that even instrument dials were readable, frozen mid-rotation. The altitude gauge stuck at just under 3,000 meters, the artificial horizon, tilted steep left. Glaciologists confirm that this level of preservation could only have occurred in a specific set of conditions. Dry, compacted snowpack, followed by rapid burial beneath ice layers, sealing out oxygen and bacteria. The mountain hadn't just buried him, it had protected him. Now, these artifacts, once tools of war, rest under glass, curated not as relics of violence, but as fragile evidence of a young man's final hours. What science revealed wasn't just the mechanics of a crash. It was the slow, frozen poetry of history, finally thawed enough to be told. The recovery operation took weeks. A rotating team of alpine engineers, forensic technicians, and aviation historians worked day and night to extract the Messerschmitt Bf-109 from its frozen grave without compromising its fragile structure. The wreck was airlifted in sections, lowered by cable from the crash site to a staging zone at the base of the ridge. Each component was tagged, photographed, and wrapped like the bones of a long-lost relic, because that's exactly what it was. The plane's partial restoration began, not in a hangar, but in a climate-controlled lab outside Innsbruck. The aim wasn't to restore it to its wartime glory. It wasn't about recreating a fighter. It was about preserving a moment. The shattered canopy, still webbed with impact cracks, was kept intact. The torn fabric of the tail rudder, the faded Balkenkreuz insignia, these were left untouched. The cockpit, preserved almost entirely as it was found, became the centerpiece. Today, that restored aircraft sits in a dimly lit wing of the Bavarian Aviation Museum. A simple plaque reads, "Recovered 2024, crashed 1943. Pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Keller." Visitors peer into the cockpit through a pane of glass. Nothing moves. The seat is empty now, but the ghost still lingers. A flight jacket lies folded beside the display. And near the canopy, under soft light, the flight journal rests open to the last page. Keller's remains were returned to Stuttgart in late April. His family, descendants of a sister who never stopped hoping, gathered for a burial 81 years in the making. The Luftwaffe, now part of modern Germany's armed forces, provided military honors, not out of celebration, but remembrance. There was no flag waving, no ceremony of conquest. Just silence, a folded banner, and the soft hiss of wind through the trees. Eulogies spoke of peace, not war, of a man returned, not a soldier lost. A great-niece read from one of Hans's early letters. I don't know what I'm fighting for, but I do know I miss the sound of my mother's piano more than anything in this world. They buried him beside his parents, under a slate-gray headstone etched with frost-colored lettering. A pilot, a son, a brother, finally home, finally at rest. Long before the hikers ever found the glint of metal beneath the snow, the mountain had a reputation. Locals from scattered alpine villages whispered of strange echoes bouncing down the valleys during storms' metallic rattles, the low groan of something shifting in the ice. Old hikers told stories about glimpses of a tailfin peeking through rock in the late 80 seconds, just for a season, before vanishing again beneath the snow. Few believed them. Even fewer reported it. The glacier where Keller's plane was found had long been avoided by shepherds and climbers alike. Treacherous footing, sudden fog banks, avalanches that came without warning. But beyond the practical dangers, there was an unease people struggled to name. In taverns and mountain huts, over steaming mugs of schnapps, they'd mutter about Der Geist I am Eis, the ghost in the ice. One man, now in his 70s, claimed he found a metal panel while hiking with his brother in 1991. He'd pried it from the ground and brought it home, thinking it scrap. But it gave him chills, something about the rivets, the paint pattern. We didn't talk about it, he admitted later. It felt wrong, like it belonged to someone who wasn't ready to be disturbed. The panel sat in his shed for 30 years until the story broke. Then he quietly handed it over to the museum. Another climber, interviewed in a local newspaper, recalled hearing an engine once just for a second while camping near the ridge. It wasn't real, he said, but it felt real. I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard it again. He never went back. Whether myth or memory, the mountain had been speaking all along. Whispers carried in wind tunnels, glints of metal briefly exposed by meltwater, a cockpit entombed in silence. The truth is, Keller's Messerschmitt had nearly been found more than once, but no one had listened closely enough. Now the legend has a name. The ghost in the ice was real. His bones, his words, his plane all unearthed from the glacier like a confession long held by the land. What else the mountain knows, it hasn't said. But for 81 years, it kept Hans Keller's secret better than any man ever could. In the stillness of a museum hall, under dim lights and hushed voices, a single artifact draws the eye more than any engine part or rusted wing strut. It's the journal, small, weathered, resting beneath glass like a relic from a vanished world. Visitors pause at the last page, their breath catching just slightly when they read it. If I do not return, forgive me. 8 words, etched by hand in a cockpit above the clouds. Hans Keller vanished on Christmas Eve, 1,943 a night. The world still pretends is sacred, even in the middle of war. While families lit candles and sang quietly in homes dimmed by blackout curtains, a young pilot was alone in the sky, fighting an enemy he couldn't see. Not a plane, not a bullet, but ice, wind, and the cruel geography of a world in chaos. There's a bitter irony in that. A night meant for peace claiming a man trained for war, not in fire or glory but in white silence. The kind that blankets mountaintops and erases everything beneath it. The kind that holds on to secrets for decades and then, when no one expects it, lets them go. His final flight wasn't a battle. It was a descent into the unknown, navigated not by rage or orders, but instinct, training, and a single thought echoing louder than all the rest. Get home. That instinct was universal. It wasn't German. It wasn't military. It was human. The war moved on without him. Cities burned. Fronts shifted. Nations rose and fell. And through it all, Hans Keller waited in the ice, not to be found, not even to be remembered. Just frozen in a moment when the sky gave no answers and the mountain gave no mercy. Now, the world knows his story not through dispatches or medals, but through the ink of his own hand, pressed onto paper with shaking fingers. He didn't write for history. He wrote for forgiveness. And perhaps, in telling his story, the world grants him that. The journal lies open. The cockpit is empty. The snow still falls in the high places. And somewhere in the silence, the faintest echo of an engine still hums Lost on Christmas Eve, returning 81 years too late. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.